What's up, everybody? This is Chance back here with the next episode of OTSSD, I think is what I put on all of them. Over-the-shoulder software development. We're continuing on the TrackIt software that this is the fourth video, I think, that I've done on it. So, still in the pre-coding phase in a sense of trying to develop everything and get more or less get things hashed out before writing software, before actually writing some code. I think I said this before. Like I said, this is not typically something I would spend a lot of time on. I don't think I've spent a lot of time on it for this, but I have probably spent more time on it than I usually do. I usually just start writing code because I enjoy the writing code part, not necessarily this part. But the pre-coding phase is important for all software development to a certain extent. And the reason behind that is, right, so if you do this exercise before you start writing software, then you don't go down the wrong path. So whenever you're writing software, you start writing things, building out infrastructure, building out models in a database, building out all this, API endpoints, all this stuff. You build it all out. Well, at the end of the day, if it's wrong, you go back and fix it. And it's easier to pivot before you start than it is to pivot after you've already been working on it and got code written. So, important steps. So we've already touched on like the idea behind it. We did a feature kind of overview. It was kind of just me bumbling around talking about features we probably want. And then I don't remember I think this is the fourth video. Oh, I talked about the tech stack. So the tech stack, and then now this is the entity relational diagramming. I'm trying to figure out how my database is going to look and kind of the high level objects we need to define. So this is kind of what I got fleshed out. Hopefully everybody can see it. I record all these in 1440p. Might be able to zoom in a little bit, help it out a little bit. So I highly recommend you watch, especially ones that are going to get more detailed. Highly recommend you watch them on a large monitor. Watching them at 360p on a phone's probably not going to cut it. But anyway, so back to this. So yeah, this is be my database design at this point at least. So I based this off the MVP we did prior. So we kind of went through all the code breakouts and stuff prior. Get rid of that. Code breakouts prior, or the feature breakouts, and then the MVP, what we want to define as MVP. So that's what I got right now is what's the MVP, and so this is what I based my diagramming off of. I did take into account a few things extra that may not be in the MVP, just in the sense of trying to keep track of or trying to think ahead, so it's always good, and this is kind of what this phase is for in the software development lifecycle, the kind of the pre-writing software, the design phase, is trying to think ahead and figure out, not necessarily hacks, but good ways to structure your code that will allow you to extend it later. So software is always going to change, you're always going to have new requirements, you're always going to want to change things, add to things. Usually software is not static, so over time it changes. And due to that, you're going to want to kind of try to think through, what the possible things you're going to want in the future are, what the possible features you're going to want in the future, that type of stuff. So when you're designing some of this, you can kind of program that in. So this is kind of what I got here. I'll kind of start from here. So the first one, user ID and password, that's super straightforward. I usually use email addresses for anything that's going to be a web application just because it's easy. People usually know their email address. They may not know their username. So I put username here, but I usually just use email address. I don't actually, it depends on what I'm writing if I require it to be an email, but usually on the front end I'll put email and I'll ask for their email just because it's kind of easy to have one field. I'm going to go and change it to email over here. So anyway, so email and then the hash password, of course. So I usually keep the user the actual login object pretty light whenever I'm writing an application, and I usually have other objects that are interacted with after the fact to figure out, like access and that type of stuff. So I usually keep that pretty light. That keeps the table pretty small and just simplifies logging into the application. In the future, this will have a lot more fields in it if I do a lot more I could do a lot more with the user login object. Right now, it's just really simple to keep it everything like MVP style. But in the future, this could have, like, hey, like what MAC addresses you signed in from, what IPs you signed in from, like any sort of identifying information that we could have tied to a user. It could be stored in that to try to help with, security. And so in the future, we're going to have like phone numbers probably for two-factor authentication, maybe even authentication, application integration, that type of stuff. So the user object will probably get bigger over time. But right now, that's what I've got for the simple MVP of this application. It also lets me segregate it out. So if it's literally just your login credentials in its own table, then I can have that ideally, at some point in time, depending on how much traffic your application is getting, it could be your login traffic is pretty substantial, and so you could actually break that out pretty easily in a microservice, and you could have a microservice that handles authentication. And so, anyway, keeping it small. I like keeping it small for several reasons. Just your database loads quickly, right? If you only got 3 or 4 or 5, 6 fields in that row essentially, then your database is going to come back pretty quick. You're not shuffling a lot of data back and forth just to do a simple credential validation. And so there's that. And then here's kind of an interesting thing. I was debating on how to actually do this. So the idea behind this is you would store all these items, what I was calling them, all these items, whether it's a phone, a laptop, a TV, a car, a house, whatever. You store all these items, but I also had the concept maybe this would be used for business things, or even like spouses, right? So spouses could share some sort of common set of items. So, maybe both spouses have their own login credentials and they both get access to all, the car, the house, the whatever, business oriented, right? So you have business, every person would have their own credentials to log in on their business account. And so, but you might have several different, people want to access the same objects or the same items. And so I split it out into this organization subject. So I called it organization. I'm not sure if that's the greatest term for it, but it should work for what we're doing. So or you have an organization. The idea is the organization is separate from a user account. So users can get access to the organization. So it's like a separate entity. So there's user access, kind of a join table, or a bridge table, to whatever you want to call it, that defines how the user can access the organization. So you have you add a little bit of complexity there for access, but it does allow you to share it. So in the sense of your organization, so let's say you have a business, maybe you have a maintenance department, and you have maintenance technicians, and they all need access to modify the items, but they only want to give them access to maybe their maintenance technicians on cars. So all the vehicles maybe is under one organization structure. So you have Bob's business vehicle department. And so the vehicle department would have, all the technicians would have access to that, read and write, right? Because they want to be able to update it, if they do maintenance on the vehicle, that type of thing. But in the sense of organization structure, right? So you may have 100 people, 200 people, 300 people accessing that one structure. So that's kind of why I separated that out like that. Maybe it's not like that. Maybe the business is small enough, or they want to keep it all the same, right? So they just have one organization, and so that organization has everything. But like I said, the idea is there that they could have, your user could log in, you could have access to multiple organizations in quote marks, and they're basically just end up being grouping of objects, grouping of items in that respects. I will have to looking in the future, so there will probably be some sort of subscription-based service tied to this. So there will be some sort of pricing structure. I need to figure out how that's going to work. I'm probably going to tie it to a user, so a user can pay for a certain, pay for certain things, and then that kind of wraps it up. I don't know. I'll kind of hash that out a little later on how some of the pricing and the subscription style service wraps up together. But there will probably be some sort of cost. In my head, probably be a free tier. So some sort of free tier where you can have one organization under a user, and the user can have up to a couple hundred items, that type of thing. Maybe you can only do pictures, you can't do videos or PDFs or stuff like that. So some sort of free tier with some limitations there. And so there would be at some point either tied to the organization or tied to the user, some sort of subscription-based service that you would access, like I say, probably be user account to probably like a billing section, and so there would be like an owner user. So maybe that's something I should have here. Owner user ID. I don't know if this should be useful, but some sort of ownership ID, so that whenever I'm doing billing, I can determine, okay, well, this user is the one actually handling billing for this organization or whatever, and so I can use that to correlate the billing, whatever tier they're signed up for. Maybe you have a free tier, plus you have like a basic tier, which you get like 5 organizations, and you can store video and you can store pictures or whatever. And you can have maybe up to 15 users on the organization. And then maybe have a limited tier, and you can have unlimited users, unlimited organizations, that type of stuff. So anyway, some sort of idea for subscription base behind there. So I think there should be some sort of user ID that owns this, and they're the user ID that actually gets billed for the organization. And then that would be, cross-referenced whenever, we want to add a user. Okay, well, you don't have, you need to pay more, that type of stuff. So there will be a lot more complexity added into the organization and the user stuff whenever billing gets set up. But the MVP, I don't have that. We're basically just going to have everybody on a free tier at this point. And then I'll add that back in later after doing further development on it. So that should be pretty separate from everything. There will be some sort of billing tie-ins at some point. But for this point, the MVP, to get the MVP built, I'm not going to include that. So this is kind of next point of where stuff kind of gets more interesting. So my item, and this is kind of me trying to flesh out as much as possible. So there will be potentially other things that come up. This is not going to be an end-all be-all, which you should always take into account when you're designing something. You'll always forget something. Their users will come up with a different use case, that type of stuff. But as this is the first flesh out of this. I'm going to preface this. I have a base object that's in my database. So everything is a base object. So all these tables actually have deleted, archived, is public, and a creation timestamp on them. So all of these also have all of those on them. So that is something to keep in mind. There's no reason for me to put this on every table because it's not useful. I just put it as a base object over here in the corner, and then everybody can understand that there's a base object everything derives from, and it's got this basic information on it. So I'm not exactly sure if I'm going to use the isPublic flag for this, but an archive and deletion flag are always super helpful for anything. I don't delete anything. I archive and I archive and have a deleted flag. I don't ever delete anything. So anyway, that's important in the sense of I don't want to rehash all of this stuff. So the item is kind of the main thing. Main reason we're building this software for is this item tracking, right? So I went ahead and put some things in here. So I have an item. I have an is a template. So if it's a template, then you could use it to derive other items from it. Basically the template would make a carbon copy of that item, and then you could keep going from there all the way down to actually fill out all the information. So that's kind of just a flag there to make it easier. We talked about templating before in the sense of maybe you have a common template you use. So like you have a house and you always have these fields on the house, and you could have a template just to have a starting point there. I've got item name, item description. Name description is kind of generic things. I add everything. I don't know if it's actually useful, but name description. Then I got like some basic information I think everything would have. So I've got some of these fields we talked about prior in this MVP of some fields that like everything will probably have this basic information, and then everything will get more specific fields depending on what it is. So so anyway, so model name, model number, serial number, and purchase date are things that I kind of decided would be like global, everything would have it. And then other fields is kind of where I rolled up all the other fields you could add. So this will be dynamic in a sense of you can always add in more fields to any object. And so right now I just kind of tacked it on the side. I'm using MongoDB, and this is kind of how I denote that in my ERD. I don't know if it's the right way, but it's the way I do it. Anyway, so I just put like a little brackets there for an array. So this is, in a sense, telling me that this is an array of objects. The name is plural to also denote that. And then I just used a generic, like, I don't know, arrow between the two. So this is an embedded object. So these are embedded dictionaries inside of that object in Mongo. So Every field will have the name, which is like what they want to show up on the front end, what the value of that object is, and what the type of it is. At some point in time, it may be helpful to like limit the name and like do some sort of weird, interesting stuff for like auto suggestion. So the names all correlate. So if you always add in a field called, XYZ, you can have a drop down or some sort of auto correlation to say, okay, well, you put a space before, space after type stuff. It's the same field. So when you do filtering and stuff, you can use those for filtering. So that is one thing to think about in that point of these are dynamic. So in the future, searching could be an issue, but I think we should be able to make some sort of auto correlation type thing. Do some trimming, that type of stuff to correlate the fields. So anyway, so everything's gonna be keyed off that name. Whatever you call it will be this. If you call it, I don't know what some of the other ones are. IMEI, right? So if you call it IMEI, then that's what's going to be keyed off of. And so when you're filtering later, you can filter on IMEI number. What the value of it is, of course, you got to have the value. And then what type it is. So the idea behind the type is maybe you have a field type of an address. The address may be stretching it a little bit, but that could be, if it's a type address, then it's got a built-in line 1, line 2 of the address, cities, state, zip, that type of stuff. So you could have an address type. Maybe you have a date timestamp type that's built in. So whenever you render that field, it's rendered as a timestamp. And then, of course, you have just like basic strings. Maybe you could have some sort of number. I don't necessarily like doing numbers, but that's another idea of you could do numbers. Maybe year built would be just a number instead of a date time. Square feet could be limited to a number, whereas a trim maybe just be a text field. So anyways, that's kind of where type derives from. So it's kind of extensible later. And then there's several different ways to implement that in the back end. We'll kind of cross that bridge when we get there. But that's kind of the fields. So all those fields will be embedded in the item. Since it's Mongo, that if you're looking at this from a typical, entity relational diagram from a typical, like a Postgres or a MySQL type database, a typical SQL database, that's kind of a no-no. To just embed things, right? You would typically have another table and you'd have foreign key relationships. And actually, speaking of foreign key relationship, this is a foreign key. In Mongo, it's perfectly acceptable because everything's an object, a BSON object or a JSON object. Everything's a dictionary. So it's perfectly acceptable to have things like that rolled up. There's not a real reason to have this separate because anytime you load the item, you're probably also going to want all the fields associated with the item. So there's no real reason to separate that out because you probably always want it with the item. And then sub-items. So sub-items kind of the next thing. So this was the kind of thing we were talking about at some point in time. Allow items to have a sub-item. So I actually can't spell. Items to have a sub-item. So apparently I can't spell very much at all. Dang, I really can't spell. I wonder if my spell check was off. Probably drove anybody that watched the video probably drove them nuts. Anyway, items have sub-items. So like inside of a house, you could have a water heater or stove, that type of stuff. However you want to structure that. This could also be used for grouping. So you could have a group, and maybe that's something I should add here as well. Maybe at the very top of here is a group. Maybe there's a group distinction, a group flag. Don't know if that's gonna be useful, but looking at it here and always remove it later. So maybe there's an is group flag for grouping, that type of stuff. So sub-items, maybe you have an electronics group, and then sub-items would have all of your different fields there. So anyway, so you could have, and that's recursive, right? So you can go all the way down with sub-items and have it all the way down. So this actually may end up being a foreign key relationship. So this actually may be sub-item IDs because you'll probably not want to always have the IDs there. So maybe that's an array of foreign keys. That's not super great. Maybe it's an array of foreign keys. Set of ways, because if you get too recursive, like that'll be a really big load on the database anytime you're loading anything. So something to think about there, since it is recursive, it could get large. So that's probably gonna be a foreign key relationship, and you just deal with that as it goes. Yeah, because you won't want to embed those, because like I said, you could go recursive. You could have, 150 levels of recursion deep, and 1,000 things in each level or something, right? So that, and this also lets you, if I do foreign keys there, you could have the item be part of multiple items. I don't know what the big use case for that would be, but maybe you have some grouping that makes sense to have the item in multiple groups. So maybe you have a computer group and electronics group. Electronics encompasses all electronics, and then computers and they're about the same level. I don't know what the use case for that would be, but that technically it's allowable to have that item assigned to multiple different other items. Yeah, so I don't know what the use case for that would be, but it's technically possible doing it that way. So that's another thing to think about is whenever you're doing software is not arbitrarily limiting people if you don't have to. So if it's something straightforward to make a slight code change and it adds a lot more features or adds something that's, even though you don't think there's a reason to use it, there may be a reason at some point in time. So allowing the code to be more flexible is usually advantageous, but you can get into scope creep with that as well, just due to the fact of, you come in, you could, I could make a slight modification, but it's going to cost an extra, 150 hours to build. Like, that's probably not a great thing to do unless you actually need the feature. But if it's a feature of like, take an extra hour or two, no big deal, then maybe that's a useful feature to have. So, or a useful thing to not arbitrarily limit users. Maybe it's even easier, to add. So without the arbitrary limitations. So there are cases where limitations are useful, but like I say, if you're designing software, it's always better to not arbitrarily limit stuff because users will usually figure out some way to break your software and will want some weird feature you didn't think about. And so even though you didn't have a use case for it, users tend to find use cases for almost anything. So there's that. Some item IDs and then history. So this is what I was talking about the other day whenever we were talking about maintenance records. So maintenance records will be, historically over, have a date time with some sort of memo or description of what happened. And I kind of made the distinction of that's how we would type pictures to an object, type pictures to an item. And that'll also be used in the future for all of the different variations we have on a history item. So a history item would kind of be the base level. And then we can probably have like a receipt history item and then like maybe a car maintenance history item. So like the receipt history item, I think I talked about this some in the feature development, but maybe you would have the amount, the date, time that was purchased, that type of stuff. And so, so that would be a thing. And then you could also have, what was for the other one? Oh, a car maintenance template. So a car maintenance template would already have mileage, would have, maybe a handful of other fields that would correlate with that car maintenance. So anyway, super seemed useful to have that item there. And then, like I say, it's extensible. So similar way that we're extending an item or making templates out of items, we would also make templates out of history items. So we want to define like a receipt history item. So that would be a template. So we have this template flag so people could define templates, right? So maybe, and that's also something you may want to think about for user access is, does everyone have access to make templates? And then like maybe templates are only certain owners, there's some of that type of stuff you get going down the rabbit trail of. Maybe certain templates are only visible to certain people, right? So your maintenance guy could make his own templates potentially, and not be visible to everybody else. So something to think about there, but similar concept of a template, right? So you build out your template, your maintenance template. So you build out your, receipt template, or your maybe your receipt template has like an accounting category in it, that type of stuff. And then you could do that. There probably will need to be some sort of drop-down style. So one type here in the fields. I guess fields would also be applicable here. I didn't ever make that correlation, but that's technically the same fields. In this type, there could be a type it could be a selection type. And so maybe a selection type, maybe you have another table out here somewhere that has your different selection types. And so, you have a mileage field and it's the selection type XYZ, and then you could have a extra table out here that you could query and say, well, that field has these options, and so somebody could go in and build the options. Like I say, the accounting category may be an interesting one, right? So you have an accounting category, and so but you want to limit it to, hey, we only have these 5 categories you could go in. that type of thing. So you could add that and have that limitation there. And then your maintenance guy or whoever's doing your receipt adding could then specify that type, or they could add it. Just have a field of to be determined or something, and then your accountant or whoever come back in later get access to the software and correlate those categories. So anyway, so that's kind of what I got right now. I try to make it pretty flexible because I think there's a lot of stuff that can go on. So template comments, the comments just a text string field. Embedded files, so this is a thing. So that's how we're going to actually roll up images. So I've got kind of my image stuff over here. I'm not going to touch on them a lot because it's basically just image stuff. But anyway, that would be where you put that. Images, videos would also be there. Any like PDF style attachments or any other style of attachments we want to add. Word documents. I don't know what all the use cases would be, but any sort of embedded file type you could have, that would be there. That is going to be I didn't finish this completely, but I did do something beforehand because I didn't want to stumble through this on a video. What the comment type would be, so that type would be a similar type to, that would be a type to define if this is a receipt, this is a, whatever type of history item. So, actually I don't know if you need that because well, if you need that type field. So I'm thinking through right now, what I'm thinking through in my head is the type would have correspond to a template. So if you have your receipt template, that would basically be your type. Maybe you want to store the type. So we probably need a name here. Probably need a name here, and that would be a type name or template name. So if you derived it from a template, you'd have the template name there. That may make sense. And then you wouldn't need the type because the type would just be the template name. I'm just thinking, if you use a template, it could be useful later on if everything's templated to be able to come back and say, okay, well, I want to look at all receipts, right? So that sounds useful to be able to filter on all receipts. Probably the actual use case that I'm thinking about is the receipt use case. So anyway, that's I'm gonna leave it there. And the other fields, of course, is gonna be wrapped up the same as other fields in the item. So that's kind of what I got for an ERD right now. I think that's a good starting point to at least flesh out all these models. So yeah, I think I'm gonna grab some lunch and then we'll see where I end up. I did go ahead and get my kind of template or boilerplate type stuff. So I have kind of a template I carry forward throughout projects. So I did somewhat get that set up. I got at least initial commit done on Git and then got it at least compiling on the Python side. So it runs, and then I did some basic functional tests. I'm sure I missed a bunch of stuff, but this is a basic functional test. Put a bunch of to-dos in to modify the template to have some of this type of stuff in it. But I do have my template started, so my next video may be me going through my templates or my boilerplate type stuff that I keep around that I carry forward every project. Going through that, and then after that we can actually start fleshing out some code. So yeah, probably that's probably I'm gonna just go ahead and say my next video is gonna be going through my template, just going with a basic overview at some point in time. So check the description for the source code. I don't know what I'm gonna do right now for the source code. I don't know if I'm gonna fully open source it, put links to like certain pieces of it. I haven't figured that out yet. I do want to make it available, but I don't want to make it where somebody can just take my source code and start a business immediately from it. So I do want some sort of protection. So maybe I just need to go through some different licensing so I can release it under a certain license that allows that. I think maybe the MIT license allows that. I don't know. I need to dig through that. Once I get that figured out, then I will put a link to whatever I'm going to link to in the description. So check that out if you're interested in source code. But yeah, my goal of this is not to, give out all my secrets. My goal of this series is to go through my development cycle and just have a, like I say, over-the-shoulder style of mentoring. I don't know if mentoring is the right word, but over-the-shoulder style of learning instead of the typical course-based learning. So anyway, so that's my rant on code and how I'm going to do code. We'll see. The short answer is I don't know yet. The long answer is what I just said. So anyway, check out the playlist if you missed anything before this, or if you're watching this, there'll probably be more videos posted after this. So if you're not on the playlist, check it out. Yeah, thanks everybody, and we'll catch y'all later.